Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Háganme favor de decirme si me escuchan, please, en lo que agrego al doctor Scott. Hi, Dr. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing very fine. It's a big pleasure. Thanks a lot for accepting my invitation. I'm really honored to have you today.
I'm very happy to be here. Any chance I get to talk about creatine, I'm always very excited.
Yeah, creatine lately, it's really hard to keep up with the research. Just when I invited you, I think you published, what, two, three papers? It's hard to keep up with.
Yeah, 2, 3 papers a day is my goal.
Yeah, it was one in regards to timing, one with the conditionally essential nutrient, and I think it was another collaboration with Dr. Kando, right?
Yeah, I collaborate quite a bit with Dr. Kendo. So yeah, we got one accepted today on looking at dietary creatine intake in pregnancy. So
Awesome.
pregnant women. Um, we tried to examine whether they were consuming enough creatine in their diet, and so we had quite a few dietary records, and about 6 out of 10 pregnant women were consuming enough creatine in their diet, but 4 out of 10 aren't. And there's definitely some benefits to creatine during pregnancy.
Yeah, no, that's one of the points I would like to touch with you actually. So anyway, and also I think it's safe to say that Dr. Kando and yourself are kind of the kingpins of creatine. Am I right?
Yeah, Darren Kando is definitely the kingpin.
Ah, you're both
I'm just his sidekick.
I would say you're both the kingpins, honestly. But anyway, thanks a lot again. I know you're a really busy man, so I really appreciate your time. So anyway, let's begin with creatine. Can we begin by establishing the basics? Like, I was gonna ask, like, what is creatine? How does it work? And then we can build up to those more interesting aspects that the emergent research, like pregnant woman, like brain function, bone health, all those stuff that I think is super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So creatine is derived from 3 amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So if you put 20 amino acids together, you have a complete protein source. But creatine is just made up of 3 of those amino acids, arginine, glycine, and methionine. You can synthesize it within your liver and your kidneys. So within your body, you can make creatine. You could also get creatine in your diet as well. So certain foods like red meat, seafood, even chicken contains creatine.
Right.
So you can get it in your diet. And then you could also obviously supplement with creatine. So you can go and buy that mysterious white powder and take it through that means as well. So there's kind of 3 different ways to get it. 1 in your body, 2 through your diet, and 3 as a supplement. Once you take creatine, most of it is absorbed into your bloodstream, and then about 95% of it is taken up into your muscle. And
Right.
so that's why I think a lot of the research has focused on the benefits of creatine from a muscle perspective, because most of the creatine that's stored in your body is in your muscle. But we also have creatine in other tissues as well, such as your brain and your bones. And so that's why I think there's been some emerging research in that area to show that creatine could have a benefit in those situations. But once you get creatine into a cell, for example, your muscle, it can be converted into phosphocreatine, and that's essentially stored potential energy. So anytime that your cells require energy, they can break down phosphocreatine, make energy very rapidly, and it can help to support any energy requiring process within the muscle.
Right, and I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of creatine. When we look at the research, it's about supplementation, not like, let's say, protein, that we see studies that measure different several intakes of protein. But with creatine in specific, it's supplementation because it's, yes, we can find it in mostly meats, as you said, but we would have to consume like kilograms meat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, salmon is a fairly high concentration. You'd have to consume about 2.5 pounds of salmon per day. In kilograms, that's over a kilogram of salmon per day. So it's
Seems
nearly,
expensive.
yeah, it's expensive and it's nearly impossible to do it with food. And so I'm not aware of any study that's ever looked at trying to increase creatine stores within your muscle with food sources to enhance muscle performance. So any study that's ever been published on creatine showing the benefits of creatine has used that white powder, creatine, mostly creatine monohydrate, to enhance creatine stores and muscle performance.
That there's Celtic. Do you remember that one with Ronnie Coleman when creatine was like this obscure thing that nobody heard about and we thought it was a steroid and all that stuff. And I guess it got a reputation that nobody knew what it was, but as the research advances, I think we can begin to think about creatine as a health supplement also.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, creatine is not a steroid.
Totally.
Despite there's still a lot of people that think that it's associated with a steroid or it's kind of like a steroid. It is not a steroid. It can help you grow bigger and stronger muscles. And a lot of the research originally was in bodybuilders trying to enhance muscle adaptations. But now we know that creatine can have a variety of effects in aging populations, so older adults, potentially in certain clinical diseases as well, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, so the effects on cognition, sarcopenia, osteoporosis. Yeah, there's
Right.
numerous kind of other clinical populations that can really benefit from creatine supplementation.
You also mentioned creatine monohydrate because there are several types of creatine in the market, and the one that is the most researched is actually the cheapest, which is creatine monohydrate. Do we have any interesting emerging evidence about the other types of creatine?
Yeah, so there was a recent systematic review and meta-analysis. It was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research.
Right.
So if any of your listeners are nerds and they like to read the research, they can go there
I
and
hope they
find
are.
it. And essentially, it reviewed all the other creatine forms. And there were 17 studies that actually compared creatine monohydrate to other forms of creatine. And what they found was there was no study that showed that any other form of creatine was superior to creatine monohydrate. And
Right.
as you mentioned, the fact that creatine monohydrate is the cheapest, that's usually what I recommend. And the other thing that you mentioned as well is that it's the most studied. And so there's a lot of evidence to show that creatine monohydrate is very safe. So it's the most effective, it's safe, and it's the cheapest.
It's almost like unbelievable, right? Also, in regards to supplements in general, it's like, yeah, we need more research. Maybe yes, maybe not. But with creatine, it's like it works. We know how it works, and it also turns out to be cheap, which I think it's exceptional for a supplement.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm always worried about doing podcasts like this because too many people will find out that creatine is so good and the benefits of
It's gonna go
creatine,
up in price.
and the price is going to go way up. Right now, it's
Yes.
about 19 cents for 5 grams of creatine. So it's very cheap. And again, there's lots of benefits to taking creatine.
Very well. So in regards to fintech, actually, I have two questions for you, Dr. Scott. The first one is a loading phase really necessary, or maybe we can cheapen out even more by not doing so and just being a little bit more patient? And also, I think one that doesn't really have, as far as I know, a concrete answer, the caffeine and creatine, let's say, are very competitive between the both.
Yeah, those are both great questions. The loading phase is not required. So there
Right.
was a great study. It was done in the early 1990s, so quite a few years ago now, and they compared taking 20 grams a day for 5 days. So that's like the traditional loading phase. And then it went to a maintenance dose. There was a second group that just got 3 grams of creatine per day. And they found that after 28 days, they had the same increase in muscle creatine stores. So just taking 3 grams a day without doing the loading phase, you'll saturate your muscles with creatine. So that was basically some evidence to show that you do not have to do that loading phase to load your muscles with creatine, but it might take a little bit longer if you take a lower dose. So usually it comes back to why are you taking creatine, and when do you want the advantages of creatine? If you want them right away, and maybe take the loading phase. If you are just taking creatine to get healthier and you're looking at kind of the long-term effects of creatine, then I would suggest just taking a lower dose, and no loading phase is required.
In regards to the dosing, because I don't think it would be the same, or correct me if I'm wrong, please. Let's say we have a 50 kilogram, I don't know what would be in pounds. Let's say, I think 120 pounds, something like that, female, and then 225-pound male. Is it the same with the 3 grams of creatine per day, or do we need to be more specific with the dosage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from my knowledge, no one's actually compared absolute dosage, so like grams, to a relative dosage. But a lot of our studies, we use a relative dosing. So we actually give 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram of body weight per day. And so that does account for a bigger person might need a little bit more creatine. And it's basically just through speculation that we think a bigger person would need more. But we need that research to confirm that answer. But yeah, that's a great question. And there is a little bit of evidence that actually a higher dose of creatine might be required to see some bone benefits. So that's a lot of the research done by Dr. Darren Kandow and actually my former master supervisor, Phil Chillibeck. They're conducting a lot of research looking at the effects of creatine on bone. And they show that 0.1 grams per kilogram per day is an effective dose, not only to enhance muscle performance, but also to enhance bone adaptations as well.
Very well. So in regards to caffeine consumption, do we need to separate the both? Because I'm sure you've seen those in the market that we have pre-workouts that have also, they have both. They have creatine, they have caffeine, which I think kind of beats the purpose, because creatine is not per se a pre-workout ingredient, maybe caffeine. But do we need to separate the both? Do we have any sort of good data on this, or are we still in muddy waters? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so we just fairly recently we published a paper where we combined creatine and caffeine and compared that to creatine alone, and also we compared that to caffeine alone, and there was also a placebo group. So there was a lot of groups in that particular study, and we measured gains in muscle mass with an ultrasound. So an ultrasound, you can look at how thick your tissue is, how thick the muscle tissue is, and we can precisely measure how big your muscle gets over time. And so we measured a whole bunch of different sites, upper body, like your elbow flexors, biceps, which is, I think is the most important muscle. We measured we measured tricep, leg extensors, leg flexors, and we also measured strength adaptations as well. And so on one variable, we actually found that for knee extensor muscle thickness, so your quadricep muscle thickness, with regards to the group that just took creatine, there was a significant increase in the amount of muscle thickness in their quads over the training program. But when they took creatine and caffeine, there was less change in quadricep muscle thickness. So there potentially is some sort of interaction, but that was for one of the multitude of variables that we actually measured. There's actually been some short-term studies as well that suggest that taking creatine and caffeine at the same time, they might counter each other. So they have opposing effects at the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a part of the cell that releases and takes in calcium. And calcium is important for muscular contractions. So we found on one variable in that small study that taking creatine and caffeine at the same time was not a good idea. And as you mentioned, that you don't have to take creatine just before you exercise. That's not the purpose of creatine. It's to saturate your muscles over time. And so I would suggest, based off that data, take caffeine before you exercise and take creatine perhaps after you exercise.
Very well. In that study, did you use caffeine pills as a supplement, or was it with coffee, plain coffee?
It was caffeine anhydrous, so a powder form of caffeine. Yeah.
Very well. So taking advantage of that one, the timing of creatine intake. Most people say that it really doesn't matter, but perhaps, as you said, there could be a little advantage of taking it post-workout, right? Do you think it's something we really need to worry about, or as long as you take it, whenever you take it, you're covered?
Yeah, so my opinion on this has actually changed a little bit because we've conducted a few studies, and we published one study relatively recently that's kind of changed my mind on that particular topic. So previously to this recent study, there were 3 studies that have been published. And if you put those 3 studies together, it looked like after was slightly better than before. But those studies used what's known as a between subject design, where basically if you join the study, you would get randomized to ingest creatine either before training or after training. So let's say, Daniela, you get creatine after training, and you train for 8 weeks, and we measure how big your muscles get and how strong you get over that training program. I joined the study and I get the opposite condition. So if you got creatine before, I get creatine after, and we see how jacked Dr. Forbes gets when I take creatine after training and train for 8 weeks or whatever the training program was. But we have different genetics. We have different dietary intake.
Your prior training, your prior adaptations, a lot of variables, right?
Absolutely. So we've recently conducted what's known as a within subject design. So this is where I essentially split your body in half. So one side of your body trained one day and it got creatine before training or after training. And then the other side of your body trained the next day and it got the opposite condition. So this is where you can really tease out the benefits or no benefits, I guess, of creatine timing, because now you're like a control for yourself because you have the same genetics, you have the same sleep. It's the perfect design. And we actually found no difference between taking creatine before training and after training.
Interesting.
Now my opinion is take creatine before or after, whatever best suits the individual and when they're going to take it consistently. And we've actually also done a study to show that taking creatine during training is also an effective strategy. So if you want to take it before, during, or after, whenever's the best time for you, that's the best time to take creatine.
Some people would argue that perhaps combining creatine after workout with carbohydrates, let's say with Gatorade or some sports beverage, but what you just said, I think just maybe just an adherence strategy, right? As long as you take it, whenever you want to take it, if you don't forget to take it, whatever, right?
Yeah, so there is some evidence. Paul Greenhalgh, he's from the UK. He was one of the early researchers with regards to creatine supplementation. And he's shown that if you take creatine with carbohydrates, that you can actually increase creatine uptake into the muscle. So this would be possibly important during the loading phase, or if you're taking a lower dose of creatine and you're trying to saturate your muscles as quickly as possible, then take creatine with a carbohydrate, or you can also take it with a protein source as well. So both protein and carbohydrates are going to stimulate insulin, and that's going to help the uptake of creatine into the muscle.
You actually did work with Stuart Phillips on that regard, right?
With who's that?
I think it was with Stuart Phillips, Dr. Stuart Phillips from McMaster University.
Yeah, so I haven't worked with Stu. I know Stu quite well, and
Yeah, it was
so
that was
is it?
something about protein. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, I would like to collaborate with him at some point, and perhaps do a creatine protein
Right,
study with
right.
him. But
Yeah.
yeah, Stu Phillips is one of the world-renowned experts in protein metabolism and protein supplementation. And he's
Right.
also published some research on creatine, particularly in older adults. He published a meta-analysis in 2014 that showed that if older adults took creatine and resistance trained, they got bigger and stronger muscles. We also published a meta-analysis that year, actually about 3 months before he published his, so we beat him to it. But we found the same findings, that if they take creatine and resistance train, they get bigger and stronger muscles.
Very well. So I think that covers the basics of creatine. Now we'd like to move on to cognitive function, brain function in general. I recall a study that I think it was in vegetarians that took like some sort of cognitive test, and the ones that supplemented priorhand with creatine did better. So do we have any mechanisms, any further research on that regard, Dr. Scott?
Yeah, so we know that if you supplement with creatine, you can increase the amount of creatine within your brain. It
Right.
doesn't seem to be as robust as what happens in the muscle. So in the muscle, you get about a 20% increase in the amount of creatine within your muscles when you supplement. The brain, it's about 10%, and the variability is huge. So some studies have actually found no increase in brain creatine content, whereas other studies have found 14% increase in brain creatine content. So it seems like it's a little bit more difficult to get creatine into the brain, but your brain could actually synthesize its own creatine.
Right.
We also, at the blood-brain barrier, we could also transport creatine into the brain, but there's fewer creatine transporters at the brain than there are at the muscle. So first of all, yeah, you can get creatine into the brain. You can. It's a little bit more challenging, but you can do it. Once creatine's in the brain, it's used to create energy, just like it is in the muscle. And it seems to be of benefit for, particularly in certain situations, to help cognitive function. And some of those situations are when you're sleep deprived. So if you don't get
Oh,
enough sleep, creatine supplementation seems to be effective at enhancing cognitive function. Also, hypoxia, so a low amount of oxygen going to your brain. We know that impairs your cognition, but if you take creatine, it's not impaired. There's also mental fatigue or stress, which can affect your brain creatine content levels, and we know that creatine supplementation seems to be a benefit in that particular situation as well. And there's a little bit of emerging research, particularly in rats, that creatine might be of benefit if they have a traumatic brain injury. So, which could be huge for concussions and things like that. But more research in humans definitely needs to be done.
very well. I recall also a study, or maybe it was several studies, in regards to depression treatment that we can optimize or better the symptoms with creatine. Obviously, not ignoring the clinical treatment, but adding creatine. Do we have any more further evidence on that?
Yeah, so there was a pretty cool study that just came out 2020, and there was a previous study 2019 as well. I can't remember the exact sample size, but it was a very large study, tens of thousands of people, and they looked at those that had depression, and they found that those that had depression consumed less creatine in their diet. So there was this relationship between dietary creatine intake and depression. So I think more research now needs to, perhaps in those individuals that have depression, what happens if they take creatine? Can they get better? So I think those studies need to be done, but there's definitely a relationship that's been established between dietary creatine intake and depression.
But at this point, we can really make recommendations, right? Like maybe you need a little bit more of 3 grams. We're not at that point, right? It's all emerging research, like you said.
Yeah, so I would be cautious about saying that creatine prevents depression or cures depression, but there definitely does seem to be that relationship. So I'm always really cautious as a scientist. I like to see the data, and I like to have a lot of data before I make a conclusion. But yeah, there's definitely some promise in that particular area.
Very well. So now, in regards to bone health, I think it was a recent paper by actually Dr. Kando this year, I think. It was intervention. Was it with elderly women? Am I right?
Yeah. So postmenopausal women.
Right.
It was a 12-month training study with creatine, and they showed some benefits. So creatine can impact the bone in 2 ways. One, we know that if you take creatine and you train, you can get bigger and stronger muscles, and those muscles pull on the bones. So it can create a little bit of stress on the bone, and that can lead to bone adaptations over time. A second way is there's actually a really cool cell culture study where they had osteoblasts. So those are the bone forming cells, and they put some creatine in those cell cultures, and it increased the activity of the osteoblasts. So the bone forming cells were actually working faster compared to before without creatine. So creatine can have a direct impact on bone, and then also an indirect effect through the muscles. And what Darren Kando and colleagues showed was that if you took creatine and resistance trained, you can get stronger bones over a 12-month period in postmenopausal women. So he's actually has data now that he's just working on. It was a 2-year training study in over 200 older adults, men and women, looking at the effects of creatine.
Quite the endeavor.
Yeah, and he says there's some positive findings. So I'm really excited for him to publish that research and to find out what it actually says.
Right. So in regards to bone health, do we have any further recommendations, or are we still with maybe 3 to 5 grams standardized dosing, or do you think we need a little bit more creatine or even less creatine for those effects?
So it seems like we need a little bit more. So the only studies that have shown a positive effect on bone have used either that relative dosing of 0.1 grams per kilogram per day, or a higher dose of creatine. There was actually a Brazilian group that looked at 2 years of creatine supplementation, but without exercise. They only gave 3 grams of creatine, and they found no effect on bone. So there's a couple things. So one, you actually need to train, which I think everyone should exercise, but if you really want to see the benefits, you need to exercise. And then also you need to consume a higher dose of creatine. So perhaps at 0.1 grams per kilogram per day to get the benefits on the bone health.
I think that's gonna be like the deal breaker, right? Creatine has all these fantastic effects, but you need to exercise. I think that's gonna be a top sell. But anyway.
Yeah, unfortunately, at least in Canada, 85% of the population does not do enough exercise to meet the physical activity guidelines. So that's definitely a downside. But we also published a review looking at the effects of creatine without exercise.
How interesting.
And Of course, there could be some benefits on your brain, so on improving cognitive function, and even the studies that didn't exercise from a muscle performance standpoint. We found 11 studies in older adults, and 7 of the 11 studies found some improvements in muscle performance, even with no exercise intervention. So if you really want to make your muscles healthier, you need to exercise. And if you really want to get the best out of creatine, you need to combine it with exercise. But if you
Right.
don't exercise, there could be some small benefits to creatine supplementation.
Very well. So, in regards to creatine and overall health, could you discuss a little bit of your findings in the conditionally essential nutrient paper, please? Because I find the just the title super interesting. We didn't think of creatine like that. Like I told you, we used to think of it like this odd thing that only bodybuilders take, and that's it. But calling it a conditionally essential nutrient, I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, well, it's been tossed around as an idea for a fairly long period of time. And I would always joke with my colleagues that creatine is so important and it should be like an essential nutrient. And I collaborated on that paper with Dr. Sergej Ostojic. So he's a Serbian researcher, and he's done a lot of research in creatine supplementation. He's a medical doctor, and he was like, we should write this paper. So we wrote a perspective paper, and there's definitely some situations where we know that people don't get enough creatine in their diet. For example, vegetarians or vegans, and they seem to respond better to creatine supplementation. There's other situations where people have creatine deficits as well, like if you have impairments to your creatine transporters, that can influence how much creatine you get into your muscles. And again, creatine supplementation can be a benefit in those particular instances. So in certain situations, we said it's an essential amino acid. It's super important. So that's essentially why we wrote that paper.
And in regards to that very same topic, would you say that creatine is an essential nutrient for all sorts of populations? Let's say kids, adolescents, older adults. Do you think every specific population can benefit from creatine? Or is it more so in regards to health benefits for the elderly, or do we have any sort of data on that?
Yeah, I think creatine can be of benefit for children. There's definitely evidence for that. There's creatine. There's benefits of creatine even in pregnancy, that it can have a positive effects. There's benefits of creatine for obviously adults and older adults and different clinical populations. For some of that research, there's limited research. For example, pregnancy, and I would also say there's limited research in children presently. So we need to do more research to, again, conclusively say that it's safe. But the evidence right now says that, yeah, it could be a benefit in a variety of different populations. I would say the one situation that is a bit interesting is people that have kidney disease or renal dysfunction. So there's actually some evidence during dialysis, if they're receiving dialysis, that their creatine stores go down. And so there might be of some benefit to supplementing with creatine.
Interesting.
But there's also that risk that maybe that would put too much stress on their kidneys and also potentially do some harm. So you need to kind of balance those two things. And I think you should obviously work with a medical doctor that's very knowledgeable about creatine metabolism in those situations. There was also a Brazilian researcher who looked at creatine supplementation in somebody who had just a single kidney and showed that it was perfectly safe and healthy to do so. So that was a pretty cool study. It was just a case study, but again, showing that creatine could be a benefit in a variety of different situations.
And in pregnant women, I'm curious, what are the benefits on pregnancy?
Yeah, so There could be a few different benefits, but the main one is that it could be during the birthing process if the baby gets a lack of oxygen. So the way that creatine creates energy is it's anaerobic, so it doesn't require oxygen. So it can help to preserve cells and brain cells and things like that, even if you're getting a lack of oxygen. So during the birthing process, if anything goes wrong, there could be of some benefit to creatine supplementation in those situations.
Super interesting. I mean, the more I keep learning about creatine, the more I'm like, please take creatine, right?
Absolutely. Me too.
So in regards to creatine myths that you actually, I have it right here, the common questions and misconceptions, can we elaborate a little bit on those specifically? First, the water retention topic, because it's not the same if it's in the cell, outside the cell, and what really effect does it have? Is it positive? Can you talk a little bit of that, please, Dr. Scott?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions with creatine. And so we wrote a paper with
Yeah, yeah.
Jose Antonio and Dr. Kandau, of course, and several other creatine experts around the world. But yeah, we know that creatine helps to bring water into the cell, so intracellular, which is important because people think that it's kind of funny. People think it dehydrates you, but it also hydrates the cell at the same time. So that it's doing the complete opposite. But so
Right.
it brings water into the cell. And again, people think that that's a bad thing. So why would you want a lot of water in your cell? But that actually causes the cell to swell, and that stimulates the muscle to grow. So increasing cell swelling activates things like myogenic regulatory factors and satellite cells. And these are all important things to upregulate and phosphorylate to enhance muscle growth. And so that's one of the mechanisms where creatine works and how it functions. And so creatine brings water in, cell swells, and then you get muscle growth over time.
Would that be, if we think about it like passive mechanical tension, that let's say the cell swells and then the mechanosensors sense the swelling and then all the intracellular cascade begins and then we have an increment in the protein synthesis rate. Is this the mechanism or am I just making stuff up?
No, yeah, that's absolutely one of the
That would be?
mechanisms.
Right.
There was a great research study by Mark Tarnopolsky. He's published a lot in the creatine world, protein world, and he's also a medical doctor. He works at McMaster University with Stu Phillips. They've
All
collaborated
right.
quite a bit. Yeah, he did a great study where he looked at basically all the upregulations of mRNA and other factors within the cell, and they were all associated with osmosensing. So essentially, you bring water into the cell, that stimulates all those growth factors and different pathways that are involved with
Right, right.
increasing muscle protein synthesis.
Right, because that's one of the maybe complaints when you're talking about the bodybuilding niche, which is water retention, and specifically in a contest prep. But we actually talked with Guillermo Escalante, with Chris Barakat on their paper about peak week, and one of the key supplements in that regard was actually again creatine, because it can help with all that, and also it can help with glycogen retention, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if I talk about taking creatine and carbohydrates can help to bring more creatine into the muscle, but it also helps to bring more
More
glycogen into the
carbohydrates,
muscle as well.
right?
So those you can break those down as fuels, and so it just increases energy capacity within the muscle.
And do you think that would be an interesting aspect of creatine for endurance athletes? Or
Potentially, yeah. So I would say one of the side effects of creatine is an increase in weight.
all
And
right,
so for some athletes, if you're doing a weight bearing sport like running, it might not be the best idea to supplement with creatine. just because you're going to be carrying a little bit more water weight, a little bit more body weight, and that can impair your exercise performance. But there was a great study done by Louise Burke. And if you're involved in sport nutrition, you know the name Louise Burke. She was at the
for sure.
Australia Institute of Sport, and she did a 120-kilometer time trial. So with some elite cyclists. And what they found was if they took creatine, that it enhanced their exercise performance. So every 10 kilometers, they rotated between doing a 1 kilometer sprint. And then the next 10 kilometers, they did a 4 kilometer sprint. And they went back and forth for 120 kilometers. And what they found was the group that took creatine, they can enhance their last couple sprints during that time trial. And so it might be associated with just having more creatine in the muscle, so you can have more explosive muscle performance.
Right.
But it also might be associated with more glycogen in the muscle as well.
That's super interesting because I'm sure creatine prices are gonna go up in a couple of years with all these positive effects, endurance, strength sports, health, bone health. I mean, but it's worth.
Yeah, I totally agree. Buy it
One
now.
of the by now let's talk up on creatine. Let's buy stocks also on creatine. In regards to one of the, let's say, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Well, maybe I think so right now. But does creatine cause hair loss? That's
So
because of creatine,
yeah, so that's another common misconception.
right?
So there's
Which is
no
all
evidence.
right
There's
there.
no evidence. You don't have to worry about your beautiful hair. You're not going to lose it. So there's one study done in rugby players where they
Right.
showed that creatine increased the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone,
Yeah,
or
sure, sure.
DHT. And DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness. And so from that study, people have always said, oh, creatine causes baldness and hair loss. But there's actually no evidence that creatine actually causes hair loss, because that study never actually measured hair loss. It only measured a hormone. And then secondly, that hormone actually stayed within normal physiological ranges. So there was a statistical difference between the two groups, but the creatine group, for whatever reason, started out with about a 25% lower resting levels of DHT, and then it went up over time. But again, it was all within physiological ranges. And yeah,
Right.
my conclusion is creatine does not cause hair loss, but I'm not a very good advocate of that.
Well, if anyone was to carry out that study, I don't know how would measure hair loss.
Yeah, so there's actually, we oftentimes as researchers, we have to register our studies. And so there was a study that was registered by Grant Tinsley to look at the effects of creatine on hair loss.
Oh, really?
I believe he measures like follicle length and density and all those things. So he needs to run that study to help us out.
Yeah, but as far as we know, we're on the safe side in regards to hair loss. One of the interesting aspects that was actually the case fairly recently with caffeine was, is there any difference between males and females? Do we respond different? Do we need different dosages? Because most of the research is, as you know, carried out in males. Do we know if there's any difference and how to make up for said difference?
Yeah, so we actually published a paper just a couple days ago looking at the effects of creatine on older females. And so we know in older males that it's very effective. So it can enhance resistance training adaptations. So we
Right.
wanted to look at older females because females actually have a higher level of intramuscular creatine stores. So they seem to have more creatine within their muscle. And so they might actually not respond as well to creatine supplementation. And so we wanted to look at this. And what we actually found was that in older females, if they strength train and took creatine, they got stronger muscles, especially if the intervention was long enough. They got both an increase in upper and lower body strength compared to a placebo. But they actually we found no effect on muscle mass. So, which was pretty interesting. So, but I also think that a lot of females are afraid of taking creatine because they don't want to get bulky muscles, big muscles. And we actually have evidence to show that it can make you stronger, but it's actually not going to have any further benefit on increasing your muscle size compared to just resistance training alone. So there does seem to be some sex differences between males and females.
And are there any dosage differences in regards to sex?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of any study that's actually looked at different dosages between males and females. But just because they have higher amounts at baseline, they probably won't respond as well as males will. But it also might depend on what their diet is as well. So we know that vegetarians, for example, have lower amounts of creatine within their muscles just because they don't consume it in their diet. So there was actually, during my PhD supervisor, Dr. Gordon Bell, and co-wrote a paper with what was his name? Dan Siratak, a great researcher at the University of Alberta. And they looked at responders and non-responders to creatine. And they found that there was two factors to determine how much you would respond to creatine. One was how much you had in your muscles to start out with. And number two was your fiber type. So if you had more fast twitch fibers or type 2 fibers, you tend to respond better to creatine supplementation.
But we will need biopsies for that, right? Because I'm not aware of any method that could tell me, oh, you have more fast twitch fiber, more slow twitch fiber. Just a biopsy, right?
Yeah, so all you got to do is just rip out a chunk of muscle, stain the myosin heavy chains for different fiber types, and then you can look under a microscope and find out how much fast twitch or slow twitch fibers you have. So yeah, it's difficult to know. It's difficult to know if you're a responder or non-responder to creatine. Probably the simplest way would just be to measure your weight. And if you're gaining weight quickly with the supplement, you're probably retaining that water, and that water retention will stimulate muscle growth. But yeah, without taking a muscle biopsy, there's no way to tell.
So is there such a thing as a non-responder? I know the term is a little bit subjective and kind of misleading, but are there people that actually don't have any of these benefits or just in a really small amount?
I would say it's very rare that somebody's not going to respond even to a small amount to creatine supplementation. I'm sure that there are non-responders out there, but that's from a muscle performance standpoint. And now that we know that creatine can impact so many other tissues, I would be hesitant to say that somebody's a non-responder just because they don't gain weight or they don't gain muscle. It might have an impact on their bones. It might have an impact on their cognition. It might have an impact on several other tissues in the body.
Very well. So almost to finish up this really delightful conversation, Dr. Scott, what is the emerging research? Yeah, also, you mentioned the benefits on pregnancy, but are there any other aspects that creatine may be helpful for that are like kind of interesting as a new topic?
Yeah, so I think creatine could be a benefit in a variety of clinical populations, things like dementia or Alzheimer's disease. A lot of my research now is starting to look at just different ways to optimize creatine intake.
Right.
We know that actually just taking creatine on days that you train is an effective way to increase muscle mass and strength. But is there a difference between taking creatine just on training days or every day? Do you have to cycle on and off creatine? Those are all questions that I think we need to answer in the next couple of years, because a lot of people ask those questions.
Yeah, that's one that I was actually forgetting. As far as safety and consumption, do we have any sort of suspicion that we might need to cycle? Is it safe in the long term? What is the long term? Do we have any evidence on that?
So we know that creatine taken in recommended doses is very safe. Up to 4 years, there's evidence for. We know that for people have measured kidney function, liver enzymes, a bunch of health markers, and it's very safe. So it's one of the safest supplements that you can possibly consume. So we know that it's a safe supplement to take. But do you have to cycle on and off creatine? We don't know. So no one has conducted that research yet. So we got to get to work and perhaps conduct that study, because again, I think it can save a bunch of money if you only have to take creatine half the time. We know it's already a cheap supplement, but I'm a cheap guy and I like to save as much money as possible. And so, yeah, you potentially could save a lot of money just cycling on and off creatine. We know that it takes about 4 to 6 weeks after you saturate your muscles for creatine to return back to baseline. So if somebody does want to cycle, usually I recommend taking creatine for 4 weeks and cycling off for another 4 weeks, then back on, off, on, off. But whether that's just as effective as taking it every single day, I'm not too sure without the research.
Right. But remember, it might go up in price, so the cycling of creatine might come in handy in a close future.
Absolutely.
Very well. So I think that covers pretty much all in regards to creatine, the emerging research. It's been a real pleasure, a real honor talking to you. I'll be doing how do you say, a summary with the key aspects in Spanish. So I'll be sure to tag you, and I don't want to take any more of your time. It's really a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Dr. Scott. And I'll be sure looking forward to your research. As far as it is, it's really hard to keep up, but it's always a pleasure.
I'll make sure to tag you in all my creatine research posts. So.
Oh, I'd be delighted. So I hope you have a good
Thank
rest
you
of the
very
day.
much.
Thanks to you, Dr. Scott. Have a great day.
You too.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.